touched on it when we talked about back pain. So inflammatory problems in the spine typically present with back pain or neck pain or both. They're typically more at rest or when they wake up in the morning and reduce with activity. So that is an inflammatory pathology. A degenerative pathology involves a wide range of problems. I will probably include disc herniation also in that. But degenerative back pains are predominantly more on activity and relieved by rest, as just the opposite of inflammatory issues. Tumors in the spine also present with continuous unremitting pain that is worse at night and disturbs sleep. So these are the questions that you need to ask for each of these 6 diagnoses, and at the end of it, you need to put your patient into one of these diagnoses. Okay. So clinical examination, listen to the patient first, take a very good history, take a detailed history. If you don't come to a diagnosis at the end of the history, very likely to come to a diagnosis at the end of your examination. Examination consists of inspection, palpation, movements. Measurements have a very limited role. A detailed neurological examination and a look at the gait and some special tests. And we will cover some of these in this talk. So coming back, the first thing that you need to do is take a detailed history. Like I said, first see whether those 6 possible diagnoses, we need to fit them into those diagnoses. In addition, we need to ask for a pain history. So use the Socrates mnemonic, it's very useful. So you look at the site of the pain. So sometimes the patient may say, I've got back pain. Or in our Indian languages, it's even more complicated because in Kannada, they may say that sonte novide, bennu novide. For the patient, they are different things. So in Tamil, they may say iduppu vali irukku, mudu vali irukku. They may be completely different things as far as the patient is concerned, and you may get misled by that. So the easiest thing to do is to get the patient to point to the area of the pain. So site of pain is important. How did it start? Was it post trauma? Was it, and what is the duration of the pain? Okay. Third one is the character or nature of the pain. Is it a dull aching pain? Is it a sharp shooting pain going down the leg? R is for radiation. How does the back pain or the neck pain radiate? So does the neck pain radiate into the arms or does the back pain radiate into the legs? If the patient says, I've got leg pain also, that is not adequate. You need to ask the patient exactly where is the pain. And you need to ask him to use his finger to point out exactly where the pain is. Is it buttock? Is it back of the thigh? You ask the patient, is there leg pain? They may say there is leg pain. But, for the patient, leg may be buttock, maybe thigh also, he may be saying that's also part of the leg. So to call it a radicular pain, it has to follow the dermatome of the pain has to be in the dermatome of the affected nerve. So radiation is very important. You ask the patient to point out and tell you exactly where the pain is. Is it buttock, back of the thigh? Is it in the back of the calf, side of the calf, medial side of the calf? Because each of them are different dermatomes. And that will tell you which nerve is being affected. Is the pain associated with nausea and vomiting? So we get a lot of patients from the urology department. They may have nausea and vomiting, which may not be, which is clearly not a spine pathology. Okay, so is there any loss of weight, loss of appetite, constitutional symptoms? The other one is the timing of the pain. So to differentiate between inflammatory pain and degenerative or mechanical pain. So inflammatory pains we know are more in the morning. Degenerative pains due to degenerative pathologies are more on activity. Pains due to infections and tumors are more at night and disturb sleep. So you will have some idea of what you're dealing with. Need to know if there is back pain only, or you need to know what are the exacerbating and relieving factors. Does the pain increase on bending forward? Does the pain increase on standing? Does the pain increase on walking? And you need to also know the duration of each of this. How much can they walk? How much can they stand? How much can they sit? In addition to giving you an idea of where the pain may be arising from, it also gives you an idea of the disability that the patient has, or the severity of the disability the patient has, and what he's able to do or unable to do. It's also a good practice to rate the severity of the pain. So you can ask the patient on a scale from 1 to 10, how much pain do you have? Is it 2 pain? Is it 5 out of 10 pain? Is it 10 out of 10 pain? It gives you an idea of what you're dealing with and what kind of treatment options you need to offer the patient. So when the patient says, I've got arm pain, you need to actually ask the patient where the pain is. If it's only shoulder, it may be a shoulder pathology or a periarthritis of the shoulder. If it is arm pain, it needs to follow, you're talking about radicular pain, it needs to follow the dermatome of the involved nerve. So that's where the C6 nerve dermatome is, that's the C7 dermatome, that's the C8 dermatome. And depending on where the pain is, you will have a rough idea which nerve root you're dealing with, and that will tell you which level of disc the problem is arising from. It's the same thing with the leg pain. So is it back of thigh pain? Is it lateral side of the leg pain, which is an L5 dermatome? Is it the medial side of the leg? By leg, I mean below the knee. A leg pain, which is an L4 dermatome, or an anterior thigh pain, which is classical of an L3 radiculopathy. So the pattern of distribution is very important. So patients may have pain going down, to the shoulder or to the periscapular region from neck pain. It may be just facetogenic or muscular. And the same thing with buttock pain and posterior thigh pain may be arising from the lumbar facets. And the pain is not, the distribution of pain is not as precise as in radiculopathies. So you cannot actually make a diagnosis of which facet is involved based on the distribution of pain from the facet joints. So it's important to remember that. The other thing to ask for is a history of, like I mentioned earlier, sitting, standing, walking, lying down, how much are they able to do, how many minutes can they do each, is sleep disturbed, are they able to do their normal day-to-day activities, are they able to carry on with their professional work, and are they able to take part in recreational activities. Also ask for neurological symptoms. So ask the patient, do you feel any weakness in the leg? Is there any numbness in the leg? If they say there is numbness in the leg, you need to know whether the numbness is in one dermatome or is it non-dermatomal. So we know that, peripheral neuropathies have non-dermatomal distribution. So the patient has got pain in a glove and stocking pattern in the limbs, and it's a non-dermatomal pattern and more likely to be a peripheral neuropathy. But it's something coming from the spine, the distribution of the sensory symptoms is in a dermatomal pattern. You need to ask for bladder issues. Don't just ask them, is your bladder okay? You need to ask them, is there any frequency? Is there urgency? Is there poor stream? Is there straining? Is there retention? Do they have to wake up in the night to go to the toilet to empty their bladder? Constipation is a little more tricky because more common, but bladder will give you a better idea of the neurological status of the bladder. Also, history of constitutional symptoms, typically fever, loss of weight, and loss of appetite. If you're dealing with infections or sometimes tumors, you may have loss of weight and loss of appetite and general malaise. Other histories to ask for is the treatment history. What kind of treatment they've had before, physio or medications or surgery. What medications are they on any other medications like steroids? We know that steroids, proton pump blockers, and anti-epileptics cause osteomalacia, osteoporosis, and they may be the result of, may cause fractures in the spine later on. So be very careful. Past history, have they ever had this kind of problem before? Or if you're looking at things like inflammatory joint disorders like ankylosing spondylitis, is there a family history of that? So those are the questions that you need to ask the patients. You may not need to ask the patient all of them, but just go back to those 6 diagnoses I mentioned. You need to rule out each one of them in your history. So at the end of the history, there are a few things that you cannot miss. So pain in the back or neck or in the spine in anybody, below 16 or above 60 with new onset pain, you need to be a little careful about. Unexplained weight loss, night pain and rest pain, don't take it lightly. They need to be investigated. They may need to be referred on. If there is a history of malignancy and then the patient comes with back pain, we know that the spine is a very common site for metastasis, so be careful. Long-term steroid use patients coming with sudden onset back pain may be a fracture because we know that steroids causes significant osteoporosis. Recent serious illness or infection, and then the patient comes with severe back pain after that, maybe that the infection is seeding in the spine and causing some new infection in the spine. If there is bladder involvement, or saddle and numbness in the perianal regions. Need to take it very seriously. You may be dealing with the cauda equina syndrome. Not to be missed. They need to be investigated. May need to be referred on. So once you've finished
Thomas, this is Karthik here. Can you come again on proton pump inhibitors? What did
No, they are known to cause osteopenia and osteoporosis. So we need to be long-term use. So need to be a little careful with these things just to have an idea of what you're dealing with.
Okay, thanks. Perfect.
Examination of the spine may not be possible to examine every patient by exposing them and removing their clothes, but that's the ideal way to do it. But be respectful and gentle. I mean, this is my PG talk for PG, so I tell them this all the time. Look at deformities, imbalance, look at swelling, wasting, scars, and sinuses in the spine. Inspection, you look at the position of the head and the shoulders, look at the contour of the spine. So we know that the spine has got a thoracic kyphosis, lumbar lordosis. If you drop, I talk about plumb line later, look at the rib cage. Is it symmetrical on both sides? Are the waist creases symmetrical on both sides? Are the iliac crests at the same level on both sides, and are the limbs parallel? So basically, when you look at a patient from the back and the side, if you drop a plumb line from the back of the neck, it should fall in the natal cleft. If you drop a plumb line from the ear, or if you draw an imaginary line from the ear, it should pass through the shoulder and through the hip and around the heel area here. So that means the patient is standing erect. There is no obvious deformity of the spine. So this is an inspection. So if there is a deformity of the spine, they will look like this. Their plumb line may be shifted off to the side, like this child on the side who has scoliosis, or the lady on this side who has, you drop a plumb line from the side and you see it's falling way in front of her body. It's called a sagittal imbalance because of some degenerative conditions in the spine. And yeah, if you're wondering what plumb line is, it's this plumb line that the masons use. And it's called plumb because the weight at the bottom is made of lead. So plumb and plumb line. So once you finish the inspection, you need to inspect the patient from the front, back, and the sides. Look at palpation. To look for tenderness in the spine, you can either use your fist and thump on the spine or apply direct pressure on the spinous processes. Also, if you run your hand down the spine, you will know whether there is any sharp angular deformities like a gibbous or a step off in the spine. So that is palpation. Movements of the spine are important. You can quantify them by saying, if you're looking at lumbar spine, thoracolumbar spine, you can say that the patient is able to bend, either hands reaching up to the knees or hands reaching up to the middle of the leg, or able to touch the toes. Gives you an idea of the flexibility of the spine. At the same time, you need to also look at whether it causes pain or not. So if the pain more on flexion, more on extension, pain more on flexion may indicate that the anterior structures like the disc are the pain generators, whereas pain on extension, you're loading the posterior structures, which are the facet joints. And if there is any arthritis in the facet joints, you may have pain on extension. So thoracolumbar spine, this is what you look at. So that's the amount of flexion that you get. You have around 30 degrees of extension possible, side bending 30 degrees to either side, and rotation of the thoracic spine. So if you get them to rotate without moving the pelvis. So that is what the range of movements you're looking at. And so too with the cervical spine, you have flexion, forward bending, you have extension. It's around 45 degrees either way. You have rotations, so you can get the patient to get the chin to the shoulders on either side. You have around 80 degrees of rotation there, and lateral flexion 45 degrees to either side. Just gives you an idea of the range of movement. Is it restricted, not restricted? Is it painful, not painful? Okay, a neurological examination is terribly important. So specifically concentrate on power, sensations, reflexes, and gait. I know it may not be possible to do it on every patient who comes, but if you have a patient coming with back pain, at least get them to walk on their heels and on their toes. And that way you can sort of rule out an L5, S1, an L4, L5, and an S1 problem broadly. Okay, sensations are easier to examine. So I'm not going to go into that neurological examination part in detail. straight leg, some specific tests are straight leg raising test or the SLR test. So when Mallikarjun, can you mute, please? Yeah. So a straight leg raising test is considered to be positive when you're able to reproduce the patient's leg pain by lifting the leg up like this. So it is a passive test. So you hold the heel, get the patient to lift the leg up with the knee in extension. And if the patient develops or has increased leg pain, then it's considered a positive SLR test. It just means that the nerve is probably getting irritated or by a disc in the lower back. But this SLR test is only for the lower lumbar region. So L4, L5, and S1. If you are, I'll leave this. If you are looking for upper lumbar roots, you need to do this test, which is called a femoral stretch test. Get the patient to lie on his tummy, flex the knee, and extend the hip. If the patient complains of pain in the front of the thigh, that means that the patient probably has an upper lumbar radicular. So if the patient already has anterior thigh pain and you can increase the pain by this maneuver, it probably indicates an upper lumbar radicular. Also examine the gait in all patients. We do something called a tandem walk, the picture in the middle. Get them to walk foot heel to toe on a straight line. Gives you an idea of, if you're dealing with any UMN signs, upper motor neuron signs or myelopathy signs, if the patient is unstable on that, and even the Rombergs. They all posterior column, you're looking at posterior column sensations with the Rombergs, and you all know what that is. Also examine the hips and shoulders in every spine patient, because there is significant overlap in symptoms between shoulder problems and neck problems, and hip problems and lower lumbar problems. So quick examination of the shoulders would just mean lifting the arms up straight like this, hands behind the head, elbows forward, elbows back. If that they can do it comfortably, then you can clinically rule out any shoulder pathology. And hip examination, also very easy. You don't have to go into a detailed hip examination. Just see if the rotations of the hip are okay. And if the rotations of the hip are okay, then probably you're dealing with a normal hip. Pulses, don't miss them out, because leg pain, which may look like a disc herniation, may be due to vascular claudication fall, and then, presence or absence of the distal pulses may help you to differentiate between vascular claudication and neurogenic claudication. So that's the end of the examination part. And I'm coming to lumbar disc herniation or slip disc. Not an uncommon problem. So this is a 30-year-old engineer who came to our OPD with low back pain and right leg pain. And you can see on the, and as usual nowadays, patients come with MRIs. So you can see a big disc there between L4 and L5 on the sagittal images. And on the axial cuts, you can see this big disc here. So the question is, patient has got very severe pain rated at 9 out of 10 for 3 days duration. Okay, the question is, what will you do? So the rest of the talk is based on that. So we'll talk about what is the epidemiology, what the pathophysiology of leg pain is, how to make an accurate clinical diagnosis, what are some of the terminologies that you see on the MRI scans, reports, and what do they mean? What is the natural history of lumbar disc herniation? So what happens if you don't do anything? And what are the treatment options? So 2% of people have a lifetime incidence of symptomatic disc herniation. Back pain is a very common problem, but only 2 to 3% of them have that leg pain. And that's this, in colloquial terms, referred to as sciatica. The mean age of onset is around 35. So in their mid-30s is when they commonly develop it, but it's uncommon below the age of 20 and after the age of 60, uncommon. The predominance is equal in males and females, although females may present a decade later than in males. The cause of the pain is not compression alone. That's something that you need to remember, however big the disc is. We know that the disc is an avascular structure, and once the nucleus comes out of the confines of the disc, the body is unable to recognize those proteins. So the body thinks it's a foreign body. So there is an intense inflammatory reaction, and that inflammatory reaction and a little bit of compression on the nerve is what causes the leg pain. So there are two components to the leg pain. There is a mechanical compression component and there's an inflammatory component. So how do we diagnose them? So the symptoms should match the signs, should match the imaging. So symptoms should be, so when you say patient has got a lumbar disc herniation, you are saying that the patient has got pain radiating down into the leg in the dermatome of the affected nerve. Okay, it is not buttock pain, it's not back pain, it is leg pain. And signs may be an SLR, maybe a positive neurological, maybe some neurological deficits, which point to that nerve that is affected. And if the imaging correlates with that level or that nerve that is getting compressed, then you have a clinical radiological correlation, and that is the success to a successful outcome. That's the key to a successful outcome. So like we mentioned earlier, an SLR is important. So straight leg raising test, if you're able to reproduce the patient's leg pain, not back pain, leg pain with an SLR, that means the SLR is positive. Do a quick neurological examination. If you're dealing with the lumbar spine, get the patient to walk on the heels, 3 or 4 steps in the heels, 3 or 4 steps on the toes. If they're able to do that, and the EHL, or ask them to pull the big toe up, and if the EHL is strong, you sort of can be sure that there is no motor deficits related to the L4, L5, and S1 nerve roots, which is the most common areas for a disc herniation. So once you've done the clinical examination, then you need to do some investigations. So we know that for lumbar disc herniation, the most appropriate investigation to make a diagnosis is a plain MRI scan. And in the MRI scan, you'll see many different terminologies. Some of them are clearly scary for the patients, because they come back and ask us lots of questions. One of the things that they keep writing is loss of lordosis, which really does not mean anything, but it really troubles the hell out of patients. So if you're a I'm speaking about 5 terminologies that you see on the MRI. Number 1 is a normal disc. So the picture on the top here is the normal disc. This is an axial section, not a sagittal section. So in a normal disc, you will see that the back of the disc is concave. Okay? If the back of the disc is concave, you can be sure that there is no disc that has extended beyond the interspace. If the back of the disc becomes convex like this, it's a disc bulge. It's circumferential, so it's symmetrical extension beyond the interspace. That's called a disc bulge. So a lot of people have disc bulges, really nothing to worry about. As we all grow older, we are all going to have some amount of disc degeneration and disc bulges. Nothing to worry about unless they are causing symptoms. So if the disc bulge or a disc herniation is causing lumbar canal stenosis or disc or sciatica or radiculopathy, then you need to worry about it. But just the presence of disc bulges on MRI scans really don't mean anything and don't require treatment unless they are symptomatic. So the disc herniation, so we have normal disc, we have disc bulge, and you have disc herniation. There are 3 broad groups. Disc herniation can be further subdivided into 3, which is a protrusion, an extrusion, and a sequestration. These are terminologies that you commonly see on MRI reports. Have an idea what it is. So a disc protrusion is a focal herniation as opposed to symmetrical in a disc bulge. It's focal. The nucleus pulposus remains within the outermost fibers of the annulus fibrosus. This is called a disc protrusion or a contained disc herniation. Then you come to a disc extrusion or a prolapse, where the nucleus has penetrated the annulus and what is contained within the posterior, contained by the posterior longitudinal ligament. This is a disc extrusion, so it's come out more. And a disc sequestration is when an extruded part of the disc has broken off from the parent disc and is not in continuity with the rest of the disc anymore. So it's disc sequestration. So these are the terminologies that you see. Nothing to worry about unless if they're not causing symptoms, just ignore them. If they're causing symptoms, then we decide what to do about them. And how we treat any condition, especially spine included, is always based on the natural history of the condition. Yeah. So you have an MRI like this, and patient comes to you The patient can have leg pain, the patient can have motor and sensory deficits, the patient can have a cauda equina syndrome, and you're worried, oh my God, it looks like a very large disc, what will happen? So the first thing that you need to know is what will happen if you don't do anything. Then you will know what to do. So the leg pain itself. So we know that lumbar disc herniation has a favorable natural history. Hippocrates, although he did not know the exact cause of the sciatica or the leg pain, he thought it was a hip problem. But anyway, he wrote that it lasts 40 days in young men before resolving. And treatment is, he advised the treatment of warm water application, hot fermentation, and some laxatives, and donkey's milk also. So even if you give donkey's milk, I think many of them will settle down because that's the natural history of the condition. So even if you don't do anything, a majority of them, around 80% of them, will settle down spontaneously. So there are lots of studies on this which have shown that, shown a favorable natural history. A majority of them settle down on their own, get back to work. So what I'm trying to reiterate is that surgery is not required in all the patients. This is another study that was done which looked at natural history between two groups, one surgical group and non-surgical group, and by around 8 weeks there was hardly any difference between the two groups. So what I'm trying to reiterate is it's got a favorable natural history. Not all of them require surgery. A majority of them settle down with non-operative treatment. The other thing that worries people is, oh my God, he's got a massive disc herniation. So that also has got a good natural history. We know that 88% of them show resorption of the herniated mass on the MRI. And the resorption is predominantly because of that intense inflammatory reaction that is kicked off as soon as the disc comes out, thinking that it's a foreign body. And we know that the sequestrated and transligamented extruded discs, the ones that look large on the MRI, are more rapidly absorbed. And that morphological changes in the herniated mass correlates well with the clinical outcome. And this is another study which looked at the amount of inflammation that occurs in each of these discs. And they found that the larger discs, the sequestrated ones and the extruded discs, show more inflammation. So there's more chance, and that's why there's more chance of them getting resorbed. The sensory deficit is the other thing. A lot of people say, okay, the pain may go, but what about the sensory deficit? So we know that the sensory fibers are more susceptible to compression. They're first to be affected and usually the last to recover. So a lot of patients may have some residual sensory deficits in their limbs, but they're not a cause of concern because they do not significantly impair function. So just reassure the patients there's nothing to worry about, and more often than not, the sensory symptoms will settle down over time. Cauda equina syndrome is another issue altogether. Cauda equina syndrome means that you have a disc herniation in the lumbar spine that is causing numbness in the perianal region with some form of partial or complete urinary retention, may or may not be associated with weakness in the legs. This is something that requires urgent surgery and ideally within 24 hours. And there's a lot of literature on it. So there are very few emergencies in spine. This is one of them. So if anybody has severe back pain, urinary retention, perianal numbness, maybe have numbness and weakness in the legs, but the perianal numbness and urinary symptoms point to a cauda equina syndrome, they need to be referred on for urgent intervention. So what are the indications for lumbar disc surgery? Lumbar disc surgery is the failure of symptoms to subside following a reasonable period of non-operative treatment. And non-operative treatment should be continued for at least 4 to 6 weeks before you can say that non-operative treatment has failed. Unless, of course, the patient has got significant or progressive motor deficits, weakness in the leg, and you can make that out by getting the patient to walk on the heels and the toes. Or if the patient has got a cauda equina syndrome, which is characterized by bladder, urinary retention and perianal numbness. So there are lots of non-operative treatment measures available. I've spoken about them during the last session, but I'll go through it again. So these are the things that we have with us for lumbar disc herniation, mind you. So bed rest or no bed rest really does not make a difference. So if the patient is in severe pain, can't move at all, well, they can stay in bed. But I don't enforce bed rest. You can tell them to do whatever is possible for them to do within the limits of their pain, but probably better to stay at home. So enforcing bed rest, and we know that bed rest for more than 48 hours is detrimental to the spine. So rarely advise bed rest to anybody. I keep telling them that, you know, it's okay to walk around and, you know, go to the toilet by yourself and things like that. So there's little or no difference between enforced bed rest and staying active. Traction, there is no role for traction in any spinal condition, unless of course you're reducing fractures or trying to improve or using it in scoliosis. But for these lumbar disc herniations, there is no role for traction. It is still being used considerably. There is no role for traction. Physiotherapy and exercises, there's insufficient evidence to make recommendations for and against. This is from the North American Spine Society guidelines. As a standalone treatment, I don't advise patients to have physiotherapy during the acute pain phases. I tell them, take it easy, let the pain settle down, and then we will start you on physiotherapy and exercises. Very little evidence for electrotherapies in the form of shortwave, ultrasound, and TENS really don't make any great difference, but they are used extensively, I must say. Medications, NSAIDs, first line of treatment for sure. There is no evidence that one NSAID is better than the other. Some people do well with a short course of oral steroids, around 7 to 10 days, because we know that there is a significant inflammatory component that is causing the leg pain, and some of them do well with a short course of steroids, but make sure it's a short course. Anticonvulsants, gabapentin, pregabalin are being used extensively for neuropathic pain. We use them. Amitriptyline is another one that is useful. So they do provide some relief from the leg pain of lumbar disc herniation. But my go-to procedure is a fluoroscopic guided selective nerve root block. It's given in the operation theater. It takes 5 minutes. And we've done a study which has shown that there is a 80% reduction in the intensity of pain within half an hour. So most of our patients get off from the table with 70 to 80% relief, and it makes a big difference. I don't think it changes the natural history of the problem, but it definitely reduces the duration of pain, and the patient is much more comfortable post-injection. It's done as an OPD procedure in our hospital. So in conclusion, non-operative treatment definitely has a role in the treatment of lumbar disc herniations. We know what works, we know what doesn't work. We know that bed rest and traction don't work. We know that transforaminal nerve root blocks are very good options. Medications in the form of NSAIDs and pregabalin, gabapentin are good options. Failure of non-operative treatment. If the patient fails a reasonable period of non-operative treatment, then surgery is an option. And the surgery is usually in the form of a microscopic disc surgery, or just removing the portion of the disc that has come out, and the patients are out of bed and walking the next day, and most of our patients go home the next day. So that is the end of my talk, and I'm happy to take questions.
Dr. Thomas?
Yes.
A rather eminent and am I echoing too much, doctor?
You are.
So what's the solution?
Are you sitting along with somebody else?
No, doctor.
Are the two devices on in your room?
No, nothing else, doctor.
Okay. Tell us, sir.
That's an eminent doctor from Manital Hospital. I don't know how to do this.
Okay, do one thing. Just type your question onto the chat box and we'll answer it.
Right. Go ahead with the next person, doctor. I will